This session is going to be much more about groundwater, whereas the first session was about geotechnical issues. So to lead us off, we have Don McFarlane from CSIRO. Don leads the Water Flagship Programme. He is the coordinator of it in Western Australia for CSIRO. I can't introduce Don without saying that I had the pleasure of working with him at the Department of Agriculture many years ago now, shortly after I arrived from the UK. Whatever I know about groundwater is at least partly responsible to my time spent with Don. Don has also been a director at the Department of Water and, as I say, presently with CSIRO. He's going to talk to us today about high groundwater areas and how climate change might be affecting those areas and the groundwater levels. Okay, Don.
Thanks, Jim. I'll start off by doing a little bit of theory, but really most of this talk will actually be talking about real-world situations, except when we get into future climate change, of course, that's all projections. First of all, Jim asked me to start with a bit of theory about what is groundwater, and you might think that's obvious, but in fact, probably about 50% of the definitions I see of groundwater in publications quite often get it wrong. I wanted to talk a little bit about how important capillary fringes is, which is another one of the requests that Jim had, going back to some of the work that I did with my PhD, which I started about 30 years ago now on groundwater under Perth particularly. We're looking at the impact of urbanisation. Again, my PhD was on the effect of urbanisation on water cycle in Perth. And then look at stormwater and treated wastewater as possible ways of, as large water fluxes that we could consider for those areas where the water tables are falling. I know the emphasis today is actually on rising groundwater and particularly areas of high water table and areas where the planning department has indicated where they want to build housing. But I think I just want to leave you with this thought. It's really a Goldilocks situation. We don't want to have too much or too little. Too much water, and obviously we have all these problems of having to bring in sand and those sorts of things. Too little water is actually another issue we've got, a major issue here in Perth. It's not just the cracking soils and the acid sulphate soils, it's the loss of our water-dependent ecosystems and our wetlands around Perth. And I think we'll just have to see what's going to happen at the end of this summer, but certainly there'll be a lot of concern, I'm sure, if there isn't already, about the loss of the wetlands. I'll then talk about some work where we just completed a major study for the federal government on the impact of climate change on water resources in the southwest of Western Australia. And I've really just clipped out a very, very small part of that on what might happen around Perth. Sorry, I forgot that there'd be people here from the southwest as well. We do have in that information a lot on what's happening between, or could happen between Geraldton and Albany, so we do have that in the reports. Okay, well, what is groundwater? To be groundwater, it has to be two things. It has to be below the ground, obviously, but it also needs to be at greater than atmospheric pressure. And this is the thing that I think people get wrong sometimes. They think that if it's saturated, if the soil is saturated, it must be groundwater. But of course, we have the capillary fringe, which is above the water table, which is actually tension saturated. And you can tell that because if you were to drill a hole into it or dig a well into it, you'll get saturated soil in that capillary fringe area, but it won't come into the well or the bore because it's actually held at a tension. It's actually under a tension rather than pressure. So the water table is actually something that is where the saturated water in a soil is actually held at exactly atmospheric pressure. So you can see the water table can fluctuate according to atmospheric pressure, and we get some interesting effects of that. If a cold front comes through, the water table changes as a result of the change in pressure. The capillary fringe, as I say, is this area above the water table, and it's important because if we've got a high water table and you're trying to put footings, you don't know. You've got an idea where the water table is because you've got an observation bore, but you're not sure what the capillary fringe is doing above that. So I want to show some examples of capillary fringes in a minute. But basically the height of the capillary fringe, where that tension saturation area ends and you get what they call air entry, is different depending on the soil texture. So if you have gravels, that might only be a few centimetres, but if you've got sands, and I'll show you in a minute, that air entry, or where we first lose that saturation, is somewhere between 15 and 25 centimetres. So even though the water table might be at a certain level that you've measured, 15 to 25 centimetres, even in a sand, is actually still saturated. And of course, in heavy clays, it can go up to 2 metres, but sometimes you can dig into, and many times we've had cases where we've drilled into heavy clay, particularly when I was working in salinity, and it looks dry, but in fact, the clay is actually saturated, but it takes a long time to make water. So quite often, if you were to dig a hole into clay, you really need to wait several days, sometimes even a week or so, to see where that hole will make water, to see whether you've actually gone below a water table. So it's a bit tricky. The other thing that I'll show you in a minute is this concept of field capacity, which I think this is Soil Science 101. Basically, if a soil is allowed to drain, wet and allowed to drain freely for a couple of days, there's a certain ability for the soil to retain water, and the field capacity in Perth sands is somewhere between 5 and 7% by volume. So at saturation, they might be 30% saturated, but if allowed to drain by volume, you'll end up with about 5 to 7% of water. What happens then is that plants get into that water, they actually reduce it below that, and then you go down to something called wilting point, but I won't go into that at the moment. So if I just bear with me for a minute, this is real data. The lines here are actually what we call the matrix potential, or the soil moisture characteristic for sands. And I've got 6 examples of this, but you can see that at the bottom here, this is where the water table is. You can see that by volume, about 30% of that volume is actually water when you hit the water table. Interestingly, when you come up, generally between 15 and 25 centimetres, this is the capillary fringe, but you can see it doesn't immediately drop down to the field capacity, which is up here at about 2 metres. It's actually got this, and this is why they call it a moisture characteristic. It's characteristic of each soil. So if this was a clay, you'd end up with it sort of going up perhaps a metre, and then you'll actually have a much slower drop-off in water content. So I should have mentioned this is water content here, and this is actually height above water table. And it's there's a number of examples there, but generally you have to be about a metre above the water table before you start getting a water content that's close to the field capacity. So I was interested in hearing Jeff earlier on saying the capillary fringe in Perth sands is about 300 mils, I think he said. This is actually an indication that this is up to 200 mils, and you've probably got about starting to get towards the field capacity for that soil. I just want to point out 2 things. There are there's dot points there, which are actually actual field measurements of those soils at a certain time of the year, and the lines are actually laboratory measurements. Very good correlation, except in 2 cases. This one here, where the field measurements are actually showing that, in fact, the soil has been dried to a lot lower than its moisture characteristic. And that's a case where there was a street tree. The street tree was very nicely getting into the water table, the top of the water table. The roots tend not to like to go into below the water table. And this is very characteristic that you quite often get trees that love to get into that area, just in that capillary fringe or that area above the capillary fringe. So trees are one way where you can dry out soils, obviously. It's been used around the world everywhere, and eucalypts are being used around the world because they're so good at it. The other one that looks a bit strange here is this one here, and that's an area which was very excessively irrigated using bore water, and you can see that is not at field capacity. That is water that soil is much wetter and is actually freely draining down to the water table. So that's the end of the theory. We'll now get into some data. This is some data that a couple of colleagues of mine at CSIRO have put together recently, and it's a report that's on the web. Tony Smith and Daniel Pollock have looked at and analysed the changes in the groundwater levels that happened over this 10-year period between 1998 and 2007. So it doesn't include this very, very dry year. So this is an analysis of what's happened to the water table in that 10-year period. And you can see immediately that most of the falls have actually been recorded north of the river. This is associated with abstraction in some cases. You can see the well at Wellfield there, for instance. You can see the areas where the pine plantations are preventing much recharge occurring through them. But you've also, I should have mentioned that anything that's yellow or red is actually a fall in levels over that 10-year period, and you have to get into the blues before you actually get a net rise. And you can see that it's a very difference between north and south of the river, and certainly south of the river, particularly down the Jandakot Mound and that sort of areas, there actually hasn't been anything like the reduction in levels that have occurred. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. Less abstraction, no pines. It's actually another issue, which is actually it's got shallow aquifer and it's a thin aquifer, and it's topped up much more easily than there's the Nangara aquifer. As most of you know, there's some major drainage through there as well, which controls the levels. But this is actually, and I'll get onto it later on when we look at the impact of climate change. What is very, very important about it is what is the depth of the water table in areas as to whether we're getting a change as a result of climate. I won't go into in any detail in this talk, but there is some interest as well in. I started doing my PhD in the late 70s because of the problems we had with a lot of backyard bores, saltwater intrusion occurring. Saltwater intrusion will be an issue sometime in the future, almost certainly. We just haven't seen it for a while, but if we keep getting winters like we've got, we will certainly see it again. So this actually map on the right here, sorry, I should say, has got some areas where there's, the salt water is actually becoming a little bit more interesting. So looking at recharge and discharge, as I say, one of the issues that we have as we infill, particularly in Perth, but also as we urbanise Perth, is that we actually alter the recharge-discharge relationships very, very markedly. Obviously, when we clear an area, we reduce the evaporative loss. When we create roads and roofs, we collect a lot of water. Mostly in Perth, that ends up back into the aquifer system. So actually, we're reducing evapotranspiration, and we're also increasing recharge by, if we put stormwater particularly back into the system. We sometimes import water, of course. The other issue is that as you infill areas, and this is what's happening increasingly around Perth, you're actually putting more and more shedding areas, and if you keep putting that back into the aquifer, you can see you're doing two things. You're actually increasing the net recharge to that aquifer at the same time as reducing the area that needs to be irrigated. So if someone puts a battle axe development out the back where it used to be irrigated lawn, you've now got a double whammy there. You're reducing the amount of irrigated lawn, but you're also actually increasing the amount of recharge that's occurring off that roof, that new roof surface. So you can see in a drying climate, we could get a balance, and according to the intensity of urban development. This is assuming that we're actually recycling this water, so all the runoff from the roof and the roads go back into the aquifer. One of the things that I found way back in the early 80s was that was probably at about an R15, so we've had 15 houses per hectare in an area. The amount of recharge that's coming off roofs and roads was probably about enough because people had a lot of backyard bores, and at that stage we thought there were a lot of backyard bores when there were 65,000 backyard bores. Now I think it's 178,000 backyard bores, but you can see that we are actually recycling stormwater effectively and roof runoff by using groundwater in Perth. Interestingly, some of those areas which I looked at which had lots of excess water, particularly the area around Shenton Park Lake, for instance, which is Lake Julbup now, is actually got groundwater levels falling, and it's possible that the balance for urban intensity now is probably over R20 under the current climate, under the current hotter and drier climate. That's just a guess, I haven't calculated it. Now looking at, if we're going to have, I've just showed you where the groundwater levels are falling, we're getting a hotter and drier climate. I'll show you some projections of where it might be in 2030 in a few minutes. Whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. Looking at stormwater, now these numbers, even though they're only a couple of years old, are probably out of date already. But you can see that there were estimates done by GHD in 2008 and by people in the Water Corporation in 2007 as to how much water was going down main drains around Perth. I won't go through how they estimated them, but you can see that the numbers here are adding up to significant amounts of water. In the drier periods, the lower water tables, those numbers are decreasing quite rapidly. Interestingly, only about 40% was estimated to be actually the normal stormwater, which you'd think that results from rainfall. About 60% of it was actually as a result of drainage of groundwater. Now, there's a reason for that. The main drains are actually put into areas which have traditionally high water tables so that you can actually build in them. So places like Osborne Park and things. The volumes are decreasing. I've also been urged to tell you that some of these flows in these are actually environmentally sensitive or very important. So the thought of actually being able to take all that 120 gigs, if you had it, and stick it back into an aquifer somewhere, I see Ken nodding away there, you'd have some fights on your hands because they're environmentally important flows. This doesn't include local government. Local government, stormwater, and increasingly what's happening, particularly in the towns of Mosman Park and Cottesloe, as everyone knows, they're actually diverting their stormwaters back into the aquifer to stop things like saltwater intrusion. The other source of water where we could actually think of topping up the aquifer if we're losing it so much is the wastewater. Three major outfalls and that we've got at the moment are adding up to, well, in 2007 it was about 111 gigalitres. That's increasing by about 3 gigalitres a year. So this is, you can add that up because this is now 3 years out of date. Interestingly, and people don't realise it in a lot of cases, where you don't have an ocean outfall, we're already putting treated wastewater back into the aquifers. So this is the volumes that have been put back into areas like Gordon Road, which is down at Mandurah, 2.2 gigalitres a year being infiltrated in through open pits in the middle of Mandurah town without causing any problems as far as I'm aware. Try to get approval for that now, you'll probably find it much more difficult, I suspect. Okay, so they're the two major water sources if you were wanting to top up an aquifer. Looking at what is growing in a drying climate, this is data from the Water Corporation out of Water Forever. Two projections of what the wastewater flows are going to be from their wastewater treatment plants, including Alkimos, which is being built at the moment, is that you can see that if you don't have water efficiency, there's a very, very linear trend here of increasing water. So this is a very, very valuable water resource. If you get water efficiencies and less water is being used in houses, then obviously then you don't get as much wastewater return. Now, looking at it, this is a study that CSIRO just finished producing, and it's on the web by, again, Tony Smith and Daniel Pollock, is looking at where might be suitable to put water back in. So this is actually the opposite of what Jim's looking at, I think, in some ways, about where are the suitable soils where you may end up with high water problems. This is actually looking at it as where, if we were to have excess water and we wanted to put it back in, where could we put it in? Now, you'll be able to work out this grey area here, which is the Guildford Sands, or Guildford Clays, I should say. The Guildford Clays have actually got low permeability and the water tables are high at the surface. As far as trying to get water into those, you can forget them. Pink is an area with high water tables and low transmissivity, so you actually don't have much capacity to put water in. So you can consider this as trying to redirect surface water or stormwater back into an aquifer as well as managed aquifer recharge. So those areas which they've been managed to identify as pink is probably the focus. The pink and the grey areas are particularly the focus of today's discussions. Interestingly, there are also areas where light blue, where it's actually quite transmissive, and so this is a lot of the Bassendean sands and some of the Spearwood sands, where the water tables are reasonably close to the surface, but you can actually get the water in, and it's quite transmissive to get the water away if you were to build a mound. Interestingly, we actually think that they're actually quite advantageous to have actually quite high water tables and high transmissive areas. Sorry, I can't say that. Because these are actually areas where we're losing a lot of our wetlands. So if we can actually get them into those areas, we'll actually be able to use some of these stormwater and wastewater streams to actually retain some of our wetlands. And finally, the dark blue areas are highly suitable for putting lots of water back into the system because they're highly transmissive and the water tables are deep. And generally these are the Spearwood dune systems. So you can see them running up and down the coast here. Spearwood dunes, deep water tables, highly transmissive. You've got transmissivities of over 1,000 square metres a day. Now, 2 minutes? Okay, well, quickly then, looking at the impact of climate change. This is, just want to say, this is bad news. All of the climate models for Perth, for the southwest of Western Australia, indicate a hotter and drier climate. None of them are indicating we're going to get more rain by 2030. This is saying that on average we're going to have by 2030 about a 7% reduction in rainfall. It could be as much as 14%. This is a map of where the water table is on the southern part of the Swan Coastal Plain. The areas that are green are showing the areas with a high water table, where I was telling you before. It's no surprise, but particularly you can see this area to the east and to the south of the Perth Central Business District, very, very high water tables. So this is the main slide, if I can spend about 30 seconds on this, Jim. The idea is that what we've done is we've used these future climate projections or continuations of past climates and said, well, what would be the change in the water table by 2030 if we were to have those climates? And we're just interested in 4 of these. You can see if we had a continuation of the climate between 1975 and 2007, there will be areas up here on the Dandaragan Plateau, down here where the pines are coming off, where the water tables will be higher. More likely, though, we're probably going to have a continuation of a climate we've had since 1997, which has been particularly dry. That you can still see the impact of pulling the pines off, but these areas that are yellow have effectively got very little change in water table. But one of the options is we're going to have this sort of a climate in future, a much drier and hotter and climate, in which case the water tables may well decline, in this case somewhere between 0.5 metre down to 3 metres in this area that we're considering, and by much more, by up to 6 metres by 2030 in these areas. So we're actually dewatering these aquifers quite quickly. But there's an interesting pattern there. It's not just land use, it's actually water table depth as well, which I'll just spend a couple of seconds on. This is my conclusions now. I think that we've got, as a result of the hotter and drier climate, we've certainly experienced since about 1975, we've actually got quite significant falls in groundwater levels under Perth. There are local perturbations on that, depending on whether they're abstracting from it, whether we've got different land uses like pines, and whether we're putting stormwater, and particularly roof water, back into the aquifer. What was interesting though when we did this work, the areas with high water tables are much less affected with the change of climate than areas with deeper water tables. And when you think about it, the reasons for it are pretty obvious. There's a lot of rejected recharge in those areas with high water table. There isn't enough room in those areas for the aquifer to accept the incoming water if we ever do get rain in winter. And what happens in those areas is you get a lot of evapotranspiration losses and you get a lot of drainage losses. So those areas are buffered against a falling water table while the water table is quite high. Okay? Once the water table has gone below a few metres and you've lost that buffering, then the impact of a drier and hotter climate is quite marked. So it looks as if the water table is not affected by climate change, and then all of a sudden, once the evapotranspiration and drainage losses decrease, you start getting quite rapid declines in water tables. And the difference here is, I guess, is also between clay soils and sandy soils. In clay soils, even in a relatively dry climate, you can get perching of systems. So you can still get high water tables, if you like, if you conclude perch systems in clay soils, which are going to be less affected than the areas in sands. But certainly the estimates are very, very clear that in those areas where the water tables are falling and continue to fall, we'll have more easier footings, if you like, for building. But I think a lot of us would like still to keep some urban wetlands as well. There are some potential water sources for managed aquifer recharge if we want to put our mind to that. Thank you very much.